I actually gave this sermon a few weeks ago at the log church. Whoa, am I doing something wrong here? I actually gave this sermon a few weeks ago at the log church, but I'm going to give it again. I put it up on the internet, so if one or two of you have read it, you may be dismissed. You can go poke around in the kitchen. I think there's some pie. I saw some pie back there. But I give it because, well, there's a couple, more than one reason, I guess, several reasons really. But one of those reasons is that I can tell a story, and who doesn't like to tell a story? And one of the other reasons is that this is becoming increasingly significant to me in the past weeks. And so it came back to my mind again. Path through Merida. The city of Merida is in the Andes Mountains of Venezuela. The city is built on a narrow plateau. The plateau, it sits like I always thought it's like a castle. There's rivers down below it, and it sits like a castle above the rivers that surround it like a moat. And it's the home to one of the largest universities in Venezuela. When we lived there, which is now many years ago, it had about 30,000 students. College towns, as you know, usually have a culture all their own. But this seemed to be especially true in Venezuela, where both student and faculty protests were really common. And they frequently closed. When there was a protest or a riot of some kind, they frequently closed down the whole town or the city. It was not uncommon for us to see in our town where we lived, it was not uncommon for us to see the first and second graders out. We always said that's one of the first classes they have is how to protest, because they're out there with their placards protesting some injustice in the church. Merida, the city of Merida, because of the geography of the mountainous region where it is built, it's a long and a pretty narrow city, and there were really only three roads that led through the length of the city. So if you're going to traverse it, you had to pick one of those three roads. The streets were not built for the amount of traffic that they eventually had to carry, and so downtown congestion was really common. One day we were returning home, and we had to drive the length of the city we lived in the western part of Venezuela, and so we had to drive through the city to get to that area. Again, things may have changed since we've been there a couple decades ago, but I doubt it. Usually in Venezuela, or any city in Latin America, there were never any bypasses. You just had to drive through the middle of town and hope for the best, and hope there were signs to tell you where to go. As we approached the city of Merida, I suppose I should have been immediately suspicious that something was not right, because we usually took that first road we took. That was kind of the main one. That was blocked off. There were police barricades and everything. That also wasn't that uncommon. They'd block off roads for different reasons, and so we didn't even think about it. So I went to the second one, and I saw that on that second road there were cars, and they seemed to be moving. Well, moving, it might be a little misleading, because once I got in the line of cars, I realized that they were mostly stopped, bumper to bumper. But nevertheless, since I thought there's no other choice, we joined in, and in the spirit of driving in cities down there, and perhaps anywhere in the world, we just hope for the best. You hope for the best. And we expected the things to move slowly, but as we sat in our car on that hot day, this one became agonizingly slow. And so as we tediously proceeded, I noticed that as we were going past streets, the side streets, the cross streets, there were no cars on them. Something was not right in that city. The shops were all closed. They have, those steel shutters that they call them Santa Marias down there. They call them Santa Marias. Those were all closed. There was nobody on the streets. And the only street that I could see that had any cars on it at all was the one that we were on, mostly stopped. I was getting tired of sitting in the car on a hot day, and as we were passing one of the streets, I noticed a nice shady spot under a tree there. So I motioned with my arm because there was a line of traffic here, I motioned with my arm to let me through, and so we pulled off into that shady spot. I stopped the car and shut off the car, and we got out. Nathaniel and Levi were still with us. Matt and Jesse, they were growing up. They were up here already, but Nathaniel and Levi were still with us. They were little. They're small, and we got out of the car, and they started complaining about their eyes getting burning and their throat burning. I couldn't notice anything, but anyway, we were standing there, and I saw some students standing on the next street over, the third of the three streets. And they were standing on the corner there, so I decided to go over and talk with them, see what was going on. So I went over there and I said, "What's going on?" "We're having a protest." One of them told me. "Why? What happened?" "Well, 8 days ago," he gave me the explanation. 8 days ago during a party, a business student was urinating on the street. And they told me this like really matter of factly, like no one could ever see any offense in this. The guy was urinating on the street, and the policeman told him to stop. But how can you stop? Once you start, how can you stop? He said. So the policeman pushed him, and the guy. It's really not a really funny story because the policeman pushed the guy, and he hit his head on some cement. And the day before we had come through, that kid had died. He was in the hospital. He died. And so they were protesting that, and they had shut down the city. There was that one street they were allowing cars to go through, but the rest of the city was shut down. Once again, Nathaniel and Levi started complaining about their burning eyes and throat, and here my eyes also started to burn. The air did seem toxic here. There was smoke in the air. It had a chemical smell to it. Because of the emergency, the National Guard were there. And now this is, I don't know if you've been keeping up with the news, but it's terrible times in Venezuela right now. And the National Guard is not the National Guard of the days that we were there. They weren't angels back then either, but they more or less served the purpose of citizens, the safety of the citizens. And so this was not the National Guard of the present day. These days in that country, Venezuela is mostly a failed state. In these days, and ruled by the dictatorial president Maduro, and he uses the National Guard to protect that failed regime. But when we were there, it was in the 90s and the early 2000s, so things were a lot different. At that time, the government was still more or less in a democratic form, and the National Guard had the role of keeping peace in the country. Well, from where we were standing on that street, I could look down the street toward where we wanted to go, and I could see National Guardsmen on every corner. There were students, they were milling around, standing in small groups, or 3 or 4. But at the moment, everything seemed peaceful. The streets in that part of town, there were bricks all over the streets and pieces of concrete, shattered windows. They were burning, the remnants of burning tires that they had left that had been on fire. And so all this was there. I asked the student, I said, "Is the street open?" I asked him. And, well, he said, "It's open. But some students are still throwing rocks at cars and protest." He said, "We just finished a confrontation with the National Guard, and we're taking a little break," he said. He said, "But we plan on picking it up again around 3 o'clock. I thought, well, I guess even protesters have a siesta. Why not? So wisely or foolishly, I decided that if we were going to get through that city, now would be the time. It was relatively calm, and perhaps before the violence started up again, we would have passed a dangerous area. And so we returned to our car. The street was littered with rubble and concrete, but it was empty of traffic. And I thought that now, during the eye of the storm, we could dodge the pieces of concrete and hope that no one threw anything too damaging at our car, and maybe we could quickly get through. And so I backed out of my shady spot where we were parked, and I put the car into gear, and I started down the street where I had been talking to the students. As I began, however, the street seemed not so peaceful as it had been moments before. Suddenly, a group of about 30 students started running right toward the car, and I thought, we're in for an attack. But I noticed that when I saw them coming, I thought they don't have a look of in their eye like they were attacking. They seemed to be fleeing, and then not many of them had rocks. There was a couple with rocks, but not many of them had rocks. But the expression they had was more of an expression of fright. They, like I said, they weren't fighting; they were fleeing. And then I saw what it was they were fleeing from. Suddenly, it seemed huge to me. This rubber-tired National Guard tank was coming down one of the side streets, and 2 guardsmen were standing on the side firing tear gas cans at them. And so we were in the car. Vivian, always present of mind, said, "Quick, roll up your windows." And so we did. And then the tank turned down the same street that we had intended to go, and the soldiers turned the tank in the direction we wanted to go. And after they stopped and shot a couple more tear gas canister projectiles into the students, and then they went down the street, quickly down the street in front of us in the direction we wanted to go. And so seeing this opportunity, I sped up our car, and I stayed right on the tail of that tank. I thought, this is the best. The tear gas, it didn't get into us yet, and nobody's going to throw a rock at us here. And in retrospect, I don't know why that National Guard tank decided at that moment to barrel down the street, throwing tear gas canisters at the students. They weren't doing any. As I said, they were taking a break until 3:00, and they weren't doing anything at that time. They weren't standing around in big numbers. But with the National Guard tank in front of us, opening this path for us, we made a record time through that city. I felt like a halfback carrying a football and following my lineman through the guard as he plowed through the defense, opening up a hole for me. And you know, it reminded me of something else. And I thought of this as I was driving. I said, I imagine what it must have been like for Moses when he led the Israelites when they were fleeing from the Egyptian army. They had to come to a halt, and as they stood at the banks of the Red Sea, and with the Egyptian army bearing down on them from behind, in military terms, they were trapped. They were hemmed in on either side by highlands, and they had the sea in front of them, and the Egyptian army was coming behind them. The Egyptian army had every advantage. They were warriors, and they were armed. They had chariots, and they had weapons. The Israelites were not soldiers. They were former brick-making slaves, and now they were simply fleeing refugees. That's all they were. It would seem that it was going to be a rout. Except, of course, for one thing. As the Israelites trembled in their sandals, facing what they saw would be certain defeat or perhaps even annihilation, Moses said this to them. He said, "Fear not. Stand and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For these Israelites whom you see today, you will never see them again. The Lord will fight for you," he told them. "You only have to stand and be silent." Well, of course, you know what happened. Moses raised his staff, and the sea in front of them parted so that the Israelites could pass. This great event has been depicted frequently on movies. You've probably seen a movie that had this on. I'm not sure how it exactly happened, how the sea actually parted. The Bible speaks of a strong east wind that blew all during the night and swept the sea back. Some archaeologists have identified a rather shallow place in the Red Sea where they said a sufficiently strong wind could conceivably do this, and where they think the Israelites must have crossed. Perhaps. But the Bible also says that as the Israelites passed through the sea, the waters were like a wall to them, the Bible says, on the right and on their left. Whatever is the case, the Israelites were able to traverse the sea, and when the pursuing Egyptians entered into the seabed, God first caused their chariot wheels to swerve in the mud, and they drove only with great difficulty. And when the charioteers realized finally that, the hand of God is in on this, and they tried to turn around and escape, of course, you know what happened. The waters came back and submerged them all, drowned them all. True to the words of Moses, God had fought for the Israelites. At a very critical point, another very critical point of the Exodus, when things were not going at all well for Moses and the Israelites, Moses said to God, "If your presence doesn't go with us, don't send us up from here." Well, I've never been in a situation, nor I dare say none of us have ever been in a situation even remotely similar to the one that the Israelites faced at that time. But this has also been my prayer. Several times in my life, when the Lord was putting me in an entirely new and unfamiliar situation to work with a people that I did not know in a land and culture far away that I didn't know, just as Moses spoke not only for his own behalf, but also for the benefit of his people, I've sometimes been directed by God to bring my wife and my family into situations unknown and frankly insecure. And I prayed to God. I said, "If your presence doesn't go with us, don't take us up from our farm. Leave us on the farm." We look for security in every situation. And it's understandable. We desire to know the exact circumstances that we will encounter and whatever we want to have on hand, whatever resources that we need to face any and every eventuality. However, if we know that God is calling us to do something, then circumstances frankly mean nothing. It's the call of God. The call of God means everything. If my experience can be any indication, never will we have complete security of a situation laid out before us before we begin a new work. At least this has not been true in our walk of faith. Nevertheless, if we know that God is calling us to a work, there comes a time when we simply must set out. We can't pray about this continually. If God is calling us, there comes a time when we must begin. Based not on what we know, not on what we don't know, but simply based on faith. I can't imagine that when the Israelites entered into the seabed floors, they saw the water on both sides. I can't imagine they stepped in with complete confidence. But so it is with the walk of faith. That's the way it is with all of our walk of faith. We step out of what is familiar and secure. We know what to expect. And we step into what is promised. God promised that they would get to the promised land. And so they stepped out of what they knew and entered into what was promised. What we are stepping into is unknown. But we wait to see what God will do. At the other end of the Exodus, as the Israelites were about to enter the promised land, there was another water barrier, as you remember, they needed to cross. This one was the Jordan River. At the time of the year that the Israelites needed to cross it, the river was in a flood state, making the crossing even more treacherous. Their former leader, Moses, he had died. He was gone, and the first lieutenant, Joshua, was in charge now. And before crossing the Jordan, Joshua sent out the officers to circulate around the camps, so all the tribes in the camps, to instruct them as to the details of how they were to cross that water. And the instructions were these. They said, as soon as you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord being carried by the priests, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. However, be sure to maintain a distance between you, maybe about 3,000 feet. Don't come near the ark, it said, in order that you may know the way that you shall go, because you have never been this way before. That's what they told the people. So the priests took up the Ark of the Covenant, carried by the two long poles, as you know, and they started out before the people. And when the feet of the priests stepped into the river Jordan stopped flowing at a point some distance up the river. The river bed at the point of the ark became dry, at least dry enough to walk on. As the priests carrying the ark went and stood in the middle of the river, the entire nation of Israel passed them as they crossed the divide between where they had camped the night before and what was to become their home. Again, they stepped into the promise. That's where they were going, into the promise. These two water crossings, they both hold great significance to me personally. And I've thought about them often as I began a new work in a new land. I've mentioned that I've prayed the prayer of Moses, if your presence doesn't go with us, don't take us up from here. And I've also applied the principle to my journeys that the Israelites were told to do in the crossing of the Jordan. They were to allow the presence of the Lord to go before them so that He would show them the way. They hadn't been there before. They had not passed that way before. And it's been like that for my family and me on several occasions. We were instructed to do something unfamiliar to us and go and settle into a set of circumstances completely unknown to us. Some of these times have been more challenging and intense than others, but they all had their situations. But these two examples in the Bible have had significance in other ways as well. They have an allegorical application that all of us can refer to in our walk with God. First of all, let me say that they're both miraculous in their nature. Many people have tried to speculate and demonstrate how both water partings could have occurred in a natural realm, and quite possibly they're at least partially correct. But the fact is, we simply don't know. We're given no explanation in the Bible. We don't know. And so it is with our journey of faith. Many people have laid out formulas, just the correct words to say, or with just the right ordinance or religious ritual to perform so that we can begin our lives with Christ. And some of these are good things. I'm not saying they're not good things. But the fact is, we really don't understand what God does within us to help us begin. What God does in us is miraculous in nature, and it's not something we can understand. Jesus told the Pharisee Nicodemus, in order to see the kingdom of God, you must be born again. Born again, Nicodemus asked. What is that supposed to mean? The thought seemed a little bit ridiculous to him, and he wanted a coherent explanation. And I can't fault him for this. We can't fault him. We're the same way. So Jesus tried to explain it in a different way. He said, if you believe in the Son of God, you will not perish, but you will have eternal life. Well, believe in the Son of God. You know, really that's not much better. Let me ask again, what does it mean? Belief. Belief is such a subjective word. I had this example a few weeks ago, but I'm not so sure I have this example anymore. The Brewers, the Milwaukee Brewers, are doing pretty good in this year. I believe in them. That's what we say. I believe in them. The day has started out nice. I believe it's going to be a nice day. Considering our understanding of what is actually happening, saying that we believe in Jesus, when we say we believe in Jesus, it's a little better than saying we must be born again. None of us really understand it. And when we say we believe in Jesus, you know, when you say it to me or when I say it to you, we can use it, we can mean anything we want it to mean almost. There's no concrete definition for what it is to believe in Jesus. But speaking of belief in terms of everyday things, that's not what Jesus is talking about. The Brewers I mentioned, you know, I don't believe in them quite so much as I used to earlier a few weeks ago. What Jesus is talking about when he's saying that we must believe in him, we're putting our trust in him so completely that whatever may happen, we are in his care. It doesn't matter of the circumstances. Our belief remains strong. Jesus said to us as his believers, in my Father's house are many places to live, and I'm preparing a place for you. That's what we cling on to. And that's why the man Job of ancient times said, though he slay me, this is an amazing statement by Job, though he slay me, even if God should slay me, yet will I trust him. Job knew that whatever the present difficulties that he was experiencing, his place in his Father's house was secure. No matter what we are experiencing in these days, our place, if you placed your trust in the Lord, our place is in the house of our Father. And that's why the prophet Isaiah could write these words concerning what God is saying to you and me. In Isaiah chapter 43, he said, do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name, and you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they won't sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you won't be burned. Flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Holy One of Israel, the God, your Savior. God bless you. Sam?